Short story by Paul McCann, The Long Lost Son. For most people, it was a day like any other around Westmeath by the banks of Parramatta River. However, for Chris Hickey, today was not a good day, because he had to make an appearance at the family court in answer to his wife's divorce application. Rhonda, who had been his wife for 3 years, had already met someone else, and she had told Chris that she didn't love him anymore. Chris had always been a trusting soul and never did harm to anyone. How shocked he was when he heard the news. His wife dropped it on him like a bombshell. Chris never saw it coming. The writing on the wall had now become clear, and his whole life fell apart. All he ever wanted as a man was to become a father and to see his children grow into responsible adults. But Rhonda had no desire to give him any such thing, as she was much too busy with her career to become a mother, never mind a loving wife. Chris had now mixed feelings about people and life in general. He was disappointed, and love was torn from his heart like a tow truck pulling a car away from a horrific collision at the crossroads. As bad as it was, Chris managed to walk away from the wreckage, and without looking back he started a new life without the person he had loved and trusted. And on this grey overcast morning, he parked the car near Westmeath railway station and began to walk through Parramatta Park, in the hope that the peaceful surroundings there would settle the dust on this very sombre occasion in his life. As he made his way through the park, he thought he heard somebody call his name, and as he looked around, no one was there. In this bleak autumn morning, leaves on the trees had fallen, where ducks waddled through them to gracefully glide and swim across the murky surface of Parramatta River. A family of white geese had gathered to greet Chris with a chaotic gaggle as he approached them near the bridge just before the main gate of Parramatta Park. Before he walked out the main gate, he stopped and whispered a silent prayer that the court procedure would be quick and painless. After his prayer, he felt the hurt had eased as well as the anger within him. Again he thought he heard somebody call his name. He turned around, but no one was there. So when he eventually came to the front gate, there was a well-dressed man who approached him. "Chris Hickey." "Do I know you?" Chris replied. The man smiled. "That's not important, but the message I have for you is." Chris looked puzzled and said, "What is the message?" "You have a son. His name is the same as yours, Chris. He is 2 years old now." Chris stood there for a moment, and it was like time had stood still for an eternity. And then he spoke. I don't understand. What do you mean?" The well-dressed man smiled. "About a year ago, your wife went on an overseas business trip. Am I right?" Chris shook his head and said, "Look, did my wife put you up to this?" The stranger continued, "Chris, she was gone for almost 12 months. "If this is Rhonda's idea of a sick joke," the man continued, "without you knowing, she gave birth to a baby boy and gave him to a childless couple that she had met and had made arrangements with." "Oh, look, I've just had about enough of this." Chris walked through the gate and away into the streets of Parramatta. When he arrived at the family court, the well-dressed man was already there. He looked at Chris and smiled. "Ask Rhonda when you see her today, Chris, and you will know by her response. Your son, Chris, is now 2 years old, and he lives in New York with Mr. and Mrs. Christensen. I will speak with you again soon." With that, the well-dressed man walked away, leaving Chris to think things over. Chris made his way into the allocated courtroom and took a seat and waited for his name to be called. Every case before him was quickly addressed. It was all just a routine formality for the judge and the solicitors who represented their clients. Finally, Chris and Rhonda's case was called to be heard. It was an open and close affair, and in less than 5 minutes the divorce was granted and no more was said or done. Chris wanted to get away quickly, but for some reason the lift was out of order. And as well as that, there was an incident on top of the staircase. Someone was lying unconscious on the ground. First aid was being given. Chris went over to have a closer look, and when he arrived there, to his amazement, the man who had previously spoken to him was there giving CPR to this casualty on the floor. He returned with a smile and said again to Chris, "Go and ask Rhonda about your son. Look, she's over there at the lifts. Trust me, Chris." So Chris decided that he would go over, and over he went. She saw him coming and she turned away as if he wasn't there. "Rhonda, could I have a word?" she replied. "There's nothing needs to be said. It's over." "What about my 2-year-old son who's in New York with Mr. and Mrs. Christensen?" Her face went white. Chris could tell it was true. Rhonda had just had the shock of her life. She responded, "Oh, well, how did you find out about this?" Chris stared at her as if she was a piece of trash. "I have a friend who knows everything, and I'm going to get my son, and you'll go to hell for what you've done." Suddenly the lift door opened, but Rhonda ran off in the other direction like a scalded cat, over towards the staircase. There was no one or nothing there at the top of the stairs. The previous incident must have been cleared up. But as Rhonda came to the stairs, she seemed to lose her balance and fell, banging her head on the ground. Chris watched it all happen in slow motion. The man who had spoken to Chris previously appeared again from nowhere and began to administer CPR. It was almost like an exact replica of the scene that Chris had seen before, like a repeat performance. Chris walked over, and the man who was giving first aid looked up and smiled and said, "I think it's too late for this woman. Her time is up." In a matter of seconds, an ambulance arrived at the front door of the family court. 2 ambos came up the stairs and placed Rhonda's body on a stretcher and took her away. The well-dressed man smiled and he said, "Well, Chris, I think you've got a plane to catch." Chris looked intently into the man's face and replied, "What do you mean?" "Mr. and Mrs. Christensen only have a short time left, and you need to get there and to bring your son back to Australia. He needs his real father now, Chris." "Who are you?" Chris said. "I'm just the messenger. Believe and you can't go wrong." "What must I do?" The man reached Chris an envelope and touched him on the shoulder. "All your travel documents and tickets are in here. Now go before it's too late. Take nothing for the journey except this envelope, and trust in what I am telling you. The flight leaves at 1 o'clock. The man walked away as suddenly as he had arrived. Chris rang a taxi and told the driver to rush to the airport. As the taxi made its way towards the international airport, Chris opened up the envelope and started to go through its contents. There were air tickets for New York and a return for him and his 2-year-old son, as well as a passport and a birth certificate for his son. There was an address of Mr. and Mrs. Christensen's house in New York and some photographs of the house and its son. Chris was soon on the flight bound for New York, and when he got there, he got a taxi to the address that was given to him. When he arrived to the house, it was on fire, and there was a crew of firefighters busy putting out the flames. Chris screamed out, "Please help me, somebody! My son's in there!" A firefighter walked from the home that was engulfed in flames. He was carrying a small boy. He walked over towards Chris and he smiled. Chris could hardly believe his eyes. It was the man who Chris had met in Parramatta, and he reached the boy over to Chris. Your son is alive and well and safe. Everyone else has perished in the fire, and I believe that you have another flight to catch. Go now. Find a life for you and your son. The man walked away towards the burning house. Chris shouted after him, Are you an angel? The man turned and smiled, and suddenly he disappeared. Thank you, God, for my long-lost son. The little boy looked into his father's eyes and smiled, and murmured, Daddy. The end.